Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. Today's guest is Brad Hill, host of No One Is Normal podcast and author of the book of the same name. But Brad didn't create his work because life went smoothly. He created it because it didn't. After addiction, loss, career changes, and having to start over more than once, Brad came to the realization that I think a lot of men need to hear. Struggle doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're human. So this conversation is going to be about what happens when life doesn't go to plan, what it takes to rebuild yourself, and why honest conversations matter more than ever for men who might be quietly battling their own struggles. So Brad, welcome to Midlife Men.
Philip, thank you for allowing me to be on your show. It's an honor. Thank you for that.
So if we'd met when you were at your lowest point, what was happening in your life, inside your head that perhaps people couldn't see?
I think a lot of people couldn't see my inner struggle. I think from myself and other people, is you don't see what people are facing on the outside. A lot of people have it pretty well contained on the inside. And as far as the lowest point, I kind of look back and reflect, and I think when I look back at relationships in general, my longest relationship I've ever had was with alcohol. I had 30 years of being a preteen to my teen years when I started kind of doing it more and more to my 20s. And then I think the biggest transition for me in the start of kind of everything was I got pulled over for a DUI in my early 30s. I did a refusal to blow, so they charged me with just an OWI, DUI, and then I had to get a ignition interlock put on my vehicle for a year. So every 5 to 15 minutes, I had to blow in my device so my car continue to run or to start it. I should have been at that point, all right, you need to make a change fundamentally, but it really didn't really hit me till once I had that OWI, then the external me going out turned into internal me sitting home and drinking because I didn't want to face any more consequences. So I started kind of hiding and then drinking alone, and then that just kind of snowballed, and then I got to the point where I can know how much to drink in a day and be perfectly fine and no one know. My insides felt like I was like feeling like crap, but externally I looked fine and felt fine. And from everybody else and how I approached them, you could barely even tell I had that problem.
So you were an expert then at being a kind of functioning alcoholic then, and all the planning involved in that, and I guess the effort put into that, looking back now, you could have spent on other things.
If I would have taken all the effort that I did in trying to make sure that I could have alcohol, I'd be a totally different person. We'd probably be having different conversations, and I think the big thing for me is it taught me life is going to hit you left field, right field. You just got to figure a way to find what's going on and fix it whatever you can, and not use a substance to try to mask and hide those feelings and emotions that you're trying to feel.
So what do you think, what set you on that path of out of control with alcohol? I mean, you said it started pre-teen. I mean, what were their causes that you were drinking to cope with things as a mechanism?
Yeah, I think a lot of people can probably relate, especially in the U.S. There's a pretty good breadth from the 70s, 80s, 90s kids where broken homes. My mom and my dad divorced when I was 5. So it was pretty much myself and my mom for most of my childhood and preteen and early teen life. And then that really put a lot of that lack of having that structure, the father figure in your house, and he never really made the effort. His biggest accomplishment of him coming to me was coming to my high school graduation. You know, I think that was probably one of the best feelings in the world, but also kind of that, you know, he showed up for that. Well, that's great, but everything else is kind of like, well, where were you for all these other things? And I think for me, it was two times I sat on a front porch at our apartment from where we lived and waited for him to show up in the summer to come pick me up. First time, car troubles, broke down. Second time, he got picked up and went to jail. Are those true? I don't know. I think they might have been excuses, but and then later in his life, he ended up going to prison for having meth in a unregistered firearm and unlicensed firearm. Spent, I think, 10 years in prison. Um, and then I just kind of just started to utilize alcohol as a way of coping for the inadequacy because I didn't feel good enough for people. And I think that was a lot of people feel that when they're coming from a broken home, you don't have that validation quite as much. Somebody's busting their ass and you don't get that, like that love and appreciation sometimes because somebody's busy working two jobs. My dad never paid child support. He always worked cash jobs. So it was just me and my mom. She worked her ass off and, it was a lot of that struggle and that kind of helped me to kind of, or not helped me, but pushed me into the little bit of alcohol. I think my first issue with alcohol I was in fact at my father's for, I think it had to have been like sixth, seventh grade. My uncle was there. We ended up playing cards. I ended up drinking beer, drinking Mad Dog 2020. That's not good, especially for even a preteen, but it's not good for somebody who's 21, right? But ended up drinking and then I ended up getting sick for like 2 days. So super sick. And that should have been my, hey, this is not good for you. It's toxic. It's poison. But in my mind, I was like, well, that's just what it does,
And then that, I guess, 5 years turns into 10 years, turns into longer. And, it became a habit that you couldn't stop. And were you, outwardly then, did anybody realize, were you just pretending you were okay? Did you share how you were feeling with anyone?
Like most people, especially men, right? We're taught to stuff it down and not feel anything. I think that's what society kind of puts into everybody's head. Like, you can't talk about feelings. You can't talk about this. You got to just come in, show up. It shows weakness and be strong and just be this statuesque person. And, that's not, that's not ideal. And, you just start burying everything. And then eventually it just gets to be too much. And you just keep kind of spiraling slowly around that drain, right?
And what was happening, the impact of this, this behavior, was it starting to have an impact on your life? You mentioned relationships. I mean, was it starting to become more tangible?
Relationships in a way, like I said, I focused more on the long-term relationship with alcohol than I did on the relationships I was currently in at the time. I think that negatively affected the people I was with. I didn't, I wasn't abusive. I wasn't anything else as far as kind of like the stereotypical somebody come home drunk, beat somebody up. I'm a pretty quiet and reserved person. So for somebody to get a rise out of me, they really got to step on a trigger, right? And I'm pretty laid back. So I think that's kind of a blessing that I didn't, if I would have been a hothead, it would be way different for me. I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now.
And so, what sort of age are you now where you're starting to think, I can't keep doing this anymore? What do those moments look like?
Well, when you sit in a doctor's office and you're just like telling them, hey, I feel like garbage every day. And you're not even thinking about the alcohol. You're just thinking like, hey, give me something to patch me up and put me back in the game because I don't want to give up the alcohol. I want to just live my life how I want. And then that doesn't work that way. The alcohol just, as your body just stops processing everything else and focuses on the alcohol every day, it just doesn't start to do the essential function. You just start feeling worse and worse. And that's kind of where I was like, okay, if I don't change my behavior, I'm definitely going to have an early grave.
And was that enough to make you sit up and listen to yourself?
Yes, but those types of things are temporary, right? Once the pain or the suffering kind of goes away, you forget about that, and it's easy to, like, I've had a few times where I've relapsed, and um, I think one time I relapsed. We were building a house. We sold our house, and we were in limbo, staying at an Airbnb, spending like $300 a day because we had pets. So we had to stay someplace, and we couldn't move to like my parents or anything for like a week or two. So we were sitting in this Airbnb, and one day I just said, you know what, I want to drink. Nothing really happened besides us, like me being upset that we had another like 3-4 days. We had to rent this Airbnb. We're stuck in this small little place with 5 animals, and it was just kind of like, I'm gonna have a drink, man. So I went and had a drink, just to really destroyed 300 days sober, and started that cycle over. And it took me, God, 3 to 4 months to kind of start looking at it again, and then about another 6 months till I stopped, and then went on another streak, and had I left a job. It was draining me. I was working 7 days a week, and I just got to the point. I said, guys, I'm done. When I left that job, I trained my replacement just so it was a new endeavor for them. So I had to make sure I set them up um, well. I got their production up and running, but I think the big thing for me was I was just getting so burnt out, because like I'd work 12, 13 hours during the week, and then Saturday I'd do invoicing, and then Sunday I would start prepping everything for the week for all the new production. And it like the team that I had working for me too, they were working 12s and 7 days a week, and it was just to the point where I'm like, my health is more important than this. And I left that position and that role, and took some time, finished kind of writing my book in that time frame, started a new job path. And I took that time, one, to figure out what I wanted to do. But when I did that, I also slipped back into drinking, because you lose your identity, and you're like, oh man, it could become stressful because I didn't have another job lined up. So the money starts going away, and you're like, oh, I got like a 6-month to a 12-month window where I'm safe. And then once it starts getting closer to that, you're like, oh, you start to get that panic and stress. And then that hit me. And then it took me about 3 months to turn the switch on and turn the switch off.
So you kind of went back to, that kind of the drinking because you kind of knew you could do it. And I mean, without being a stupid question, every time you said you went 300 days dry and then, broke that. I mean, how did that feel? Because from what you've just said, it sounds like that happened over and over again. How did you find strength to kind of then start, especially if you must have thought, well, you know what, it might be temporary again, and then I'm going to drink again.
Yeah, that was probably the hardest thing, because you feel like a failure, right? Relapse is probably one of the things in that happens in life. You can have breakups, you can have other things financially happen, but when you relapse and kind of start that machine, like I realize I have an on-off switch. I don't have a dimmer switch, right? Like if I turn that switch on with alcohol, it stays on, and I can party till I can't party no more and sleep, and then it just goes that way. And then I do have some like alcoholism in the family, but not anything that was super severe. But and the weird thing is, some people have a couple drinks, they get a hangover. I could drink almost a bottle of Jameson and be like, meh, wake up the next day and be fine. Just a little thirsty. And I think that's where you can really start to feel like okay, I'm starting to really affect my body and my mind. And yeah, I can tell the difference in myself when I'm drinking and when I'm not. When I'm drinking, I tend to do what I need to do. When I'm not drinking, I tend to go above and beyond for things. And you can definitely tell there's a big difference between sober Brad and drinking Brad.
So what was the you talked about these relapses. What was the point, the final point where you did it and thought, right, this is no more? Was there a trigger? Did you perhaps go to a group? There's lots of, Alcoholics Anonymous. There's other groups out there that can help.
I ended up using a couple things. I ended up listening to Alcohol Lied to You as an ebook, and I listened to that every day going to work. I also listened to Alcohol is Shit. That was another good one, and it kind of talks through the process. And it seems like when you listen to people and they talk about their problems and they go through it and really kind of start to dial in some of the psychological things and some of the environmental things that you really got to start looking at. And then another thing I started utilizing was Reframe. It's an app that works really well. It gives you daily stuff to look at, to read. It gives you kind of a full scale of what's going on in your body, how things are happening. You can set up meetings on there. There's meetings pretty much all day long. So those things helped me as a tool. I tried AA, and I didn't really like the environment, to give it to God type thing. And to me, that doesn't seem like that. To me, it's my work and I have to do it. Giving it to God is great, but I think I still had to put in all the effort to want to correct my position.
So that's interesting then. So you use a kind of variety of inputs, I guess, and we'll put those in the notes actually if people want to check them out for themselves. And generally, men, we've talked about the kind of social conditioning and not really asking for help at all. But, do you think there's still a lot of men out there who are not finding a way forward? They're still lost to alcohol, trying, going this cycle of relapse, and then, abstination and then falling down again. So this worked for you. What advice would you have for anyone that's really struggling and kind of doesn't really know what to do next because they keep failing?
Find your triggers. It's like everything, right? Something is going to drive a decision in your mind, and usually it's a trigger that brings you into that situation again. And I think if you do some self reflection, I really think that gives you the opportunity to, okay, what do I have to deal with that's I'm trying to hide or mask or trying to put in the past, and just time shift from the buzz of alcohol till the next day, right? And it took me a long time to figure out what my triggers were. Um, and a lot of my triggers are just me not believing in myself and beating myself up for stuff that everybody does. Everybody has a small bad day. Something happens. Work was stressful. You come home and have a couple spirits and it goes away, and then the next day you're like, well, it still sucks. But yeah, if anybody listening, it's figure out what's causing the behavior and understanding it. I think that's the first kind of step. And then once you kind of figure that out, is what resources you need to kind of help you through that process. It's stepped. You got to figure it out first, and then figure out how to get help, and then do the work that you need to kind of keep in on that path.
And did you reconcile, your experience with your dad, which, from what you said was probably one of the causes of your drinking? Did you manage to find, a way of dealing with that as well?
Yeah, what I looked at is he had married, he has a bunch of kids with different wives, and he remarried, and he had his life, and my mom married a great guy. He's my stepdad, but I call him father. He in my teen years, like my 13, I moved out to a farm, started working on a farm, and um, really understood what like work was, and what the meaning is to like, you have to get this done, otherwise you won't have food on the table type thing. So it took me from being an inner city kid to kind of just experimenting with drugs and alcohol to, going out to a farm and moving to a different school, and kind of started that process. I think one of the things that really put things into perspective for me was my wife and I were getting married in June of 2017. Big day for us. My first marriage, it was her second, but um, about 3 months before that, he got out of jail a little bit before that. He was living with his sons. But about 3 months before our wedding, I got a phone call that he died of an overdose. Um, so in my book, I talk about that, and I kind of quipped about it. I said, that's the one last thing he didn't show up for in my life. But that undertone and that pain was there. And, one is he was stuck in an addiction loop too, right? Got out of prison. Apparently he did Xanax with a family member, and then my half brothers were into drugs. They took Suboxone somehow and smoked it, and then apparently the alcohol, the Xanax, and the Suboxone, and Xanax and Suboxone don't mix at all. And I think that's what created this health event. He ended up being sick when he was there, and they ended up just putting him in bed because they were all drugged out, so they didn't want to do anything, and he ended up dying in his sleep. So that was probably one of the hardest things, is like, if he chose his life, right? The alcohol, the drugs, I think he was a drug runner at some point, and, that's a hard life. And he drank a lot, so he had, I think some of that kind of rubbed off on me. But yeah, that was probably the hardest thing, was going to the wedding, having that heavy heart. We just buried my dad, and we're getting married and celebrating the happiest moment of my life. And, it's just that kind of, you can't make that type of stuff up, right? It's like that life's going to be great, and all of a sudden, oh, curveball, train wreck. Okay, that's great.
Which is, as no one is normal. I mean, this stuff happens, doesn't it? It happens to all of us, and so how you deal with it. So you kind of, I guess you kind of started over really then when you quit the alcohol, and what did it do? We've talked a bit about confidence, about identity. What did that do for you?
Alcohol gave me false confidence, right? It gives you the stupidity gene where you can, I can do this, that, and the other thing. When I actually quit alcohol, I started facing my life and realizing that I'm worth more than I think I am. And I think that was kind of the catalyst for me. Is alcohol was masking everything. It was my relationship, my confidant, but it was a one-sided relationship. It just hurt me. And I think realizing that, and actually building relationships with people and having those conversations really helped me. When writing the book, a lot of it is the short stories that I told of good, bad, and ugly things in my life. And I think that was more therapeutic for me than anything else. Just being able to talk about it, deal with it, and then go on to kind of the next subject, and just continue to tell those different stories and nuances and things I've faced, to hopefully, one, my things that happened to me, hopefully people can reflect on it and maybe start that conversation, maybe start journaling themselves to try to want to change. And I think that's where this whole movement for No One Is Normal is going, just starting that conversation and talking.
So I've talked to quite a few men actually who said that, writing things down, whether you call it journaling or you've written a book, really does help, because it helps you think about an order in your head, what happened, because you've got to write it down so somebody understands it. So what inspired you to write the book? Because not everybody can write a book, or, it's quite an undertaking. What inspired you to do it, apart from everything we've just talked about? But, it's quite an undertaking.
I think the realization that I think a lot of people face issues, right, in their life. I was molested by an uncle. I talk about that in the book. I don't go into too much detail because, you can put it into any category you want and you can look at it, but I don't want to talk about it. I've gone through that, and I've forgiven him myself. I haven't forgiven him as a person. He passed away probably about uh, 5+ years ago, but I forgave him personally for what was done to me, um, so I could move on. I think that was one of the things that really helped me to kind of put that into perspective. And, I held that for till I was in my 30s and talked to my parents about it finally. And at first they kind of don't believe you, like, oh, that didn't happen. And then when you're really serious about it and have that conversation, they're like, oh, it did. Right. I think that was probably I think some of that, probably my dad was some of it, and some of that when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old, like, kid. And I think a lot of that, kind of it's wrong. And you just didn't expect somebody to do that to you, especially a family member. And I think that tied with that kind of really put me in behind the eight ball in my teenage years.
So writing the book and talking about this, really helped you there.
Absolutely. I think for me, writing the book was just therapeutic, but putting it out there so that I can take a brunt of criticism so people can look at it and say, okay, this person can talk about this. I think I need to start talking about it. And I think that's where I wanted to put a message out there for people to really, people got to open up and talk about these things. I look at the statistics for child molestation and rape and stuff like that. And there's so many people that I've talked to that it hasn't been reported. I don't think the statistics are correct. I think they're way low from what I've heard from people, and I could be way off, but I just don't think a lot of people report those types of things, and they bury it down and just live with it for their whole life.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Because if you try and bury this stuff, it's going to come out and bite you on the arse at some point. You've got, they are scars, mental scars, sometimes physical, and you have to deal with them at some point. Otherwise, you'll live in their shadow. And I'm not a therapist, neither are you, so we can't necessarily tell you what you need to do. But it sounds like writing it all down and then writing the book and then starting to talk to other men about similar situations. So what sort of reception have you had to writing down your experiences? What have people what have their responses been?
A lot of people I've had, Shelley, she did the forward for the book. She's a counselor. She gave it to her sister and mother to read because they've been kind of struggling with each other to try to find a centerpiece. So they read my story. At the end of the book, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the book, if that's okay, just so people can kind of understand it. So the book has a bunch of short stories, 3 to 5 pages on average. I tell the story. At the end, I give a little bit of a self-reflection, and then I give like 5, 6 questions on, it gives the reader kind of the opportunity to reflect on my position and my journey, and allows them to hopefully start a journaling process, start looking at something that happened in my life, and maybe I can take a takeaway from his pain and misfortune, or this is a good story. Maybe I can tell the story, and then maybe it'll help me open up. And then at the end of the book, my wife's story, she's a domestic violence survivor. Her story is a little chronological, and she acts like the catalyst between, she's like my first guest for No One Is Normal. Because talking about something like that is very tough. And I didn't want to put her in a situation where we're just putting her, like every time we like she wrote and then I typed and we edited, and every time she talked about it, it was heavy, like tears and everything else. And then I just didn't want to put her in a situation where every time she unpacks it, it just it just kind of breaks her down for a little bit because of everything that happened. And I put that in the book because it felt important to to know that we both had some struggles in our lives, and I think the big thing is we know what happened in each other's lives. We tell each other everything, sometimes a little too much, but but I think that helped us have a very strong relationship, and nothing to hide, nothing to nothing goes undealt with. We talk about it and move things forward. I think that had I been unsuccessful in changing my train of thought and to stop being a victim, I think had I not done that, I probably wouldn't have been able to had as good a relationship with my wife as I do.
I mean, men need to talk to somebody. It's not always their wife or their partner. Sometimes, I mean, it sounds like for you that's worked out really well. But I guess the importance is to talk to somebody right, but the right person in the right environment.
Sometimes it's the spouse, right? That is the kind of the driving issue, and you got to talk about it. And that usually sometimes creates that friction a little bit. But yeah, to me, it was important just to start those lines of communication.
So looking back, what if you could talk to your teenage self, or the young Brad? What would you say to them, knowing what you know now and knowing what you've been through?
The sad thing is, I probably could talk till I'm blue in the face. Probably wouldn't have listened anyway. And that's just. I think a lot of people can think about that, and you're invincible and bulletproof. I definitely would give myself some advice to really look at. You do have the self-worth. You do have a message for people. You do have the opportunity to be something great, right? I look at things and sometimes I beat myself up way too much. And I think that's where some of my struggles are, is I'm very, very hard on myself. Somebody can be hard on me. Don't care. I'm be harder on myself than anybody else can be to me. And I don't know if that relates to you at all, but I know I can beat myself up all day long.
Yeah. Yes. I can relate to that a little bit. So kind of final question then, and I know we've talked a little bit about this already. So, someone listening to this who relates to, some of your story, all of it, a little bit of it, or knows somebody that they think is suffering as well. What advice, what one thing would you say to them, to just help move forward from whatever the situation is? And it doesn't have to be alcohol, just something that's really holding them back, that's killing them.
I think taking that mental inventory of what's happening, understanding that, and then figuring out where you want to go. You start by analyzing kind of the where you're at, looking at how you want to change, and then kind of look at future state and try to figure a path from A to B. It's might be ugly, it's like anything. It's just gonna, you might have squirrels running the show, but you still gotta get that first initial kind of, I gotta figure out me. What am I going to do to kind of fix me? And then what is my end goal for me to be where I want to be? And putting that, I mean, it's going to take work, right? Everything in life, nothing is easy at even though you want it to be. I think you just gotta want to put in the work. It's like going to the gym. It's like anything. It just getting that muscle memory, regardless of what it is. You got to get kind of that repetition in.
And thank you. And remember, no one is normal. None of us are normal. Normal doesn't exist. If people want to find your book or check out the podcast, where do they go?
The podcast is on all platforms, as well as the book. If you want, you can go on bradhhill.com. I have information for people who want to be a guest on the show. The podcast itself, I got books, got merch. I've got resources for people who are struggling. for like a suicide hotline, help for veterans, teens, just so that there's a quick link somebody can call if they're in trouble and struggling. Otherwise, nooneisnormal.co. They both go to the same site, my site. The book is on Amazon and Audible, and the podcast is on Spotify, but goes everywhere.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Brad. You've been really honest and very open with us. So, I really want to thank you for that. And I'm sure a lot of people listening can kind of relate to what you've been talking about. So thank you.
Thanks, Philip. I appreciate the time, and hopefully this can help somebody.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you want to find out more about Brad, his podcast and his book, both called No One Is Normal, then visit his website, bradhill.com. To help raise profile of the podcast, it really helps if you can review it and follow the show on your podcast platform. And please do share it with your networks and with people you think might benefit from listening. If you have a story to share, then do contact me through the website mid-lifemen.com.